necessary to protect American domestic manufacturing.
President Trump continues to take bold action to protect America's critical steel and aluminum industries.
However, anyone who takes the time to look at the data will see the reality clearly. In 2023, nearly half of all the aluminium imported by the United States came directly from Canada.
Canada produces 80% of all the primary aluminum in North America.
This tightening of supply was not just a heavy blow, it struck directly at the heart of America's industrial base. The market reacted instantly and sharply, as if a live power line had been cut. Within just one day, aluminum prices in the Midwest surged to 58 cents per pound, equivalent to $1,325 per ton, a record high for industry giants like GM, Ford, and Boeing. This left them facing an unavoidable choice: absorb the massive cost increases or halt production lines altogether. Mark Richardson, an aerospace supplier in Ohio, told CNBC that he had never seen raw material prices fluctuate so rapidly, and worse, that the federal government still had no clear plan to respond. This shock has not stopped at the factory floor. Experts warn of a domino effect that could ripple through every sector, from employment to energy consumption.
Some people out there that are starting to worry. They don't know if they need to go find another job or not.
Rising production costs are slowing the industrial engine. As output declines, electricity consumption also drops, dragging down the revenues of utility companies already struggling to maintain infrastructure. This chain reaction, sparked in Washington, led to an incident at Alcoa's plant in Davenport, Iowa. Mike Jensen, a shift supervisor, told KQWC that production had fallen to the point of being almost unmanageable. He recalled that in the past, the entire plant ran 3 full shifts continuously, but now every week, staff are sent home early for 2 shifts. "You can see the pressure on everyone's faces," Jensen said. Meanwhile, mortgage bills still arrive on schedule with no regard for aluminum prices stabilizing. In Ottawa, the atmosphere was calmer but no less urgent. The Canadian government moved quickly, injecting $1.5 billion Canadian dollars to upgrade the Alouette aluminum smelter, one of the largest facilities on the continent. At the same time, it signed a long-term, low-cost clean electricity supply contract with Hydro-Québec, securing stable costs and energy supplies for years to come. Without fanfare or showmanship, everything was done methodically and with calculated precision. For line engineer Sophie Gagnon, the announcement felt like a promise of job security. "I've worked here for 14 years and have never seen such a major investment," she said. "Most importantly, we know we'll still be here 5 years from now." Sarah Thompson, a trade analyst at Brookings, observed, "They're not reacting emotionally. They see this as an opportunity to rebuild supply chains for the long term." In the following weeks, Canada quickly signed long-term, duty-free aluminium export contracts with the EU and Japan. Shipments to the UK, Singapore, and Italy surged. Some metalworks in Asia canceled bauxite orders from the US to buy from Quebec instead, at lower prices with cleaner energy and under more stable politics. Luc Boucher, owner of a small extrusion shop in Trois-Rivières, said, "Last month we shipped our first order to Osaka. 10 years ago that would have been just a dream." However, Ottawa was not content with short-term gains. It began working on a plan to redraw North America's logistics map so that Canada's aluminium industry would no longer rely on US infrastructure. Once revealed, the plan would show just how far ahead Canada had moved. The next step from Ottawa was a powerful move, carefully prepared and backed by billions in funding. At the end of Q1 2025, the government declared clean hydro-powered aluminium a national strategic asset, placing it on par with oil and rare earth minerals. This meant tighter export controls, targeted support, and secured infrastructure investment, cementing aluminium's place as a pillar of the green economy for at least a decade. The focal point, the port of Saguenay in Quebec. Previously, more than 70% of Canada's aluminium exports had to pass through US ports or rail lines, making them vulnerable to tariffs, customs, or policy shifts. Ottawa declared that era over. A CAD $2.3 billion package was approved to expand Saguenay, enabling it to handle 69,000-ton vessels and increase cargo capacity by 15 million tons annually. Once complete, bulk terminals would connect directly to Europe and Asia, no US stopovers required. The 375-kilometer railway from the Alouette plant to Saguenay would also be upgraded with federal and provincial funding, cutting transit times by 28% and reducing costs by $12 Canadian per ton. Port CEO Pierre Gagnon stated, We're building trade sovereignty out of steel, concrete, and political will. Goods will leave on our schedule, no one else's. Mayor Julie Dufour called it a turning point for an entire generation. It was not just about metal leaving the docks, it meant new jobs, new shops, and young people returning home instead of moving to Montreal. The move aligned perfectly with the EU's CBAM mechanism coming into effect in October 2025, which heavily taxes high-carbon aluminium but exempts Quebec's hydro-powered metal. According to the European Aluminium Association, this will save Canadian exporters 180 to 200 euros per ton in taxes, an edge U.S. fossil fuel-based aluminium cannot match. Ottawa committed an additional 1.1 billion Canadian dollars to link Saguenay with Ontario's EV manufacturing chain and Manitoba's lithium battery hub. The goal, a closed-loop supply chain, aluminium frames from Quebec, batteries from Manitoba, final assembly in Ontario, all powered by clean domestic energy. In 2024 alone, EV exports rose 22% year-over-year, and Bloomberg NEF projects the figure could double by 2027 if infrastructure expansion stays on track. Geopolitically, this was a major shift. Canada could now ensure that its most valuable industrial exports could bypass the US entirely, reducing exposure to Washington's political volatility. Angela Carter, an economist at the University of Waterloo, noted that this advantage extended beyond aluminium to every downstream metal-related sector. And the next target? Not automobiles or shipping, but a sector deeply tied to US national security, where losing supply could cause serious headaches for the Pentagon. In defense, aluminium is not just for vehicles or housing. High-grade aerospace aluminium is essential for missile casings, aircraft fuselages, armored vehicle plating, and satellite frames. According to the U.S. Department of Defense's 2024 procurement report, more than 42% of imported pure aluminium came from Canada, with some missile and satellite programs depending on it for up to 60% of supply. When U.S. smelters shut down in early 2025 due to tariff impacts, Pentagon planners quickly took notice. Frank Kendall, former U.S. Undersecretary of Defense, told Defense One, "Without the right aluminium, you can't build an F-35 or a hypersonic airframe. If your ally becomes your single point of failure, you're creating a strategic risk yourself." Canada moved swiftly to turn this dependency into an advantage. In the 2025 federal budget, defense spending rose 6.2%, with 700 million Canadian dollars annually earmarked for aerospace-grade materials production and integration into NATO and Indo-Pacific defense networks. Quietly, the aim was to expand upstream capacity, modernize smelting, raise quality control standards, and lock in long-term contracts with Airbus, Lockheed Martin, and BAE Systems. Results came quickly. Rio Tinto Canada announced 3 new defense contracts in Q2 2025, prioritizing Canadian aluminium for both civilian and military aircraft. According to Aviation Week, Canada's green aluminium now sells at a 15 to 18% premium in the defense sector because it meets both environmental and high-grade metallurgical standards. Meanwhile, the U.S. defense industry is feeling the strain. The Congressional Budget Office warned in July 2025 that aluminium price volatility could add 1.3 billion Canadian dollars to Pentagon costs over the next 2 years. The F-35 assembly line in Fort Worth, Texas, has faced a 3-month delay in component deliveries, partly due to a shortage of high-grade aluminium. Canada is not only serving domestic needs but also signing defense agreements with Japan, Australia, and several EU nations, ensuring that if U.S. politics turn unfavorable, defense exports will still find a market. James Feehan, a defense economist at Memorial University, noted, "They've safeguarded their defense industry in exactly the same way they've protected aluminium exports."
That's not an accident, it's a doctrine. For the United States, this was a wake-up call. The aluminum tariff that was supposed to protect domestic industry had instead deepened military supply dependence on a foreign partner, one now building alternative alliances. And Canada wasn't stopping here.
The next step in Ottawa's strategy is no longer confined to metals or defense. It is expanding into the green technology race, where the U.S. has already lost its edge, and catching up may well be an impossible task. While Washington struggles to deal with the fallout from trade barriers, Canada has quietly built an entire closed-loop green tech ecosystem aimed squarely at the next generation of global manufacturing, and the results are already showing. Statistics Canada data reveals that in 2024, electric vehicle exports rose 22% compared to the previous year. Bloomberg and EFE forecast that by 2027, that figure could double if infrastructure projects stay on schedule. The foundation of this growth is a fully integrated supply chain that few countries can match. Ultralight aluminum frames from Quebec, lithium-ion batteries produced in Manitoba and Ontario, and assembly plants along Ontario's EV corridor, all powered by abundant, clean hydroelectricity. At the Stellantis LG battery plant in Windsor, 27-year-old assembly technician Marcus Rivera says the work is virtually non-stop. "I started right after graduating from trade school. My dad worked at a car plant that shut down in 2009, and now he says I'm helping to build the future." Lithium is the key ingredient. In 2024, Canada produced 22,000 tons of lithium carbonate equivalent, up 14% from the previous year, and with projects like Nemaska Lithium in Quebec and Snow Lake Lithium in Manitoba, output could reach 35,000 tons by 2026. According to Jose Morin, senior expert at Clean Energy Canada, the advantage lies not just in resource extraction, but in controlling every stage, from the mine to the market-ready product. Investment capital is pouring in. Skillering is spending $5 billion Canadian dollars to build a new battery plant in Windsor, in partnership with LG Energy Solution. Tesla quietly signed a long-term deal in late 2024 to source aluminium and nickel from Canada, primarily due to environmental standards and supply stability. By the second quarter of 2025, Canada had surpassed Germany, the hub of Europe's EV industry, in the number of newly announced projects. Alongside manufacturing, Ottawa's trade policy is clearing the way. Green industry agreements with the EU and UK guarantee that Canadian EVs and components are tariff-free if they meet strict emission standards. Meanwhile, many US manufacturers still rely on high-emission materials, costing them market access in these regions. Michael Harvey, Vice President of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, noted, "Every percentage point of carbon reduction is now a competitive advantage, and Canada is accumulating them strategically." By contrast, the US EV sector is hampered by a patchwork supply chain and inconsistent policy. Subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act help domestically, but international buyers remain cautious due to political uncertainty and potential export restrictions. The IEA reports that US EV export growth in 2024 was less than half of Canada's. What Ottawa is doing is not just about making cars or batteries, it is building a model that fuses national security, trade resilience, and climate policy into a single industrial strategy, capturing markets before rivals can respond. This explains why Canada is turning green tech strength into a diplomatic tool. In the first half of 2025, every shipment of low-carbon aluminium, every ton of lithium, and every finished battery became a bargaining chip in high-level negotiations. In just 6 months, Canada signed 3 major trade deals: a €4.6 billion green tech partnership with the EU for joint investment over 5 years, 15-year clean energy supply agreement with Japan ensuring Canadian aluminium remains duty-free for their automotive and aerospace sectors, and an expanded CPTPP framework giving Canadian EVs and battery components preferential tariff access. Canada's Department of International Trade says these agreements secured over 12 billion Canadian dollars in confirmed export contracts through 2030. In a speech, Minister Mary Ng stressed that Canada has moved from being a raw materials seller to a strategic partner in every negotiation table, from trade to defense to climate. The pressure is rippling globally. The European Aluminium Association's 2025 report shows German automakers are being forced to secure supply that meets zero-emission targets by 2035, with Canadian aluminium, whose price volatility is just 3.8%, seen as far safer than US aluminium, which swings by 11.5%. Japan and South Korea also view Canada as an escape route from dependence on Chinese raw materials while maintaining quality. Washington is, of course, taking notice. At a July 2025 U.S. congressional hearing, American automotive and aerospace leaders warned that Canada is locking in markets the U.S. will struggle to penetrate. Senator Maria Cantwell bluntly stated, "We're handing an entire industry to a neighbor who's negotiating with us on every front." For Ottawa, this is proof the strategy is working, embedding industrial power into long-term agreements that shield the economy from trade wars and turn any isolationist move into pressure on the other party. And trade is only part of it. Ottawa is applying the same approach to defense diplomacy, leveraging its reputation as a reliable supplier to increase influence within NATO and Indo-Pacific security dialogues. By 2025, economic strength had begun translating into strategic power. Defense spending rose 6.2%, with 700 million Canadian dollars a year dedicated to producing aerospace materials, upgrading pure aluminium refining technology, and maintaining long-term contracts with Airbus, Lockheed Martin, and BAE Systems. According to the Pentagon's 2024 procurement data, 42% of high-purity aluminium imports into the US come from Canada, with some missile and satellite programs relying on it for up to 60% of their supply, a dependency the US can scarcely replace. In the second quarter of 2025, Rio Tinto Canada announced 3 new long-term defense contracts, with green aluminium meeting NATO standards and aerospace technical requirements, fetching 15 to 18% higher prices. Meanwhile, US defense contractors are under strain. The Congressional Budget Office warned that aluminium price volatility could add $1.3 billion to Pentagon costs over the next 2 years, with the F-35 production line in Texas delayed by 3 months due to a shortage of qualifying aluminium. Ottawa, however, is expanding bilateral defense cooperation with Japan, Australia, and multiple EU nations, ensuring Canadian materials are embedded in allied defense manufacturing regardless of US policy. Defense economist James Feehan of Memorial University calls this Canada's way of armoring its defense sector, just as it has done with its industrial supply chain. By combining industry and security, Canada has become one of the few middle powers with both manufacturing capacity and diplomatic credibility to influence alliance policy from within. While the US remains bogged down in political division, Ottawa is fusing the defense card into green technology, creating a foundation of power that is nearly impossible to challenge. By late 2025, these two pillars had merged into a single strategy. The logic is clear. The nations that need Canadian materials for advanced EVs are the same ones supplying military components, and aligning export policy across both fields allows Canada to maximize its bargaining leverage. More than 60% of buyers of Canadian defense-grade aluminium also import batteries or lithium carbonate from the country, creating a natural negotiating advantage. This is no accident. The Ministry of Innovation, Science and Industry has rolled out a $1.8 billion Canadian dual supply initiative to develop technologies serving both civilian and military markets, from EV aluminium frames adaptable to fighter jets to battery chemicals suitable for naval vessels. International partners are embracing the model. Germany reports that Canadian EV batteries in its next-generation Volkswagen models share up to 70% of their supply chain with NATO aerospace components, streamlining logistics and cutting costs. Japan's Mitsubishi Heavy Industries says sourcing aluminium from Canada for both EVs and defense has reduced delivery times by 25% and price volatility by over 15% due to currency stability. For the US, however, this deepens dependency. A leaked November 2025 Pentagon internal report shows that nearly half of its aerospace aluminium suppliers are also tied to Canadian green tech companies, meaning any trade or political disruption would have a double impact on both defense and clean technology. Laura Hughes, former Pentagon materials strategist, remarked, "When your supply chains overlap like that, you're giving the supplier veto power on 2 fronts." Ottawa insists it is simply optimizing efficiency. The more dual-use contracts are signed, the more entrenched Canada's central role in both green industry and defense becomes. Positioned at the intersection of climate, trade, and security, Canada is not only shaping the North American economy, but also influencing the global industrial balance, forcing Washington to choose between adapting or falling behind. At this point, the question is not whether Canada can maintain its position, but whether the US has already fallen too far to catch up. In less than 2 years, Ottawa has transformed from a trusted supplier into a strategic hub that Europe, Asia, and even the US cannot ignore. High-speed port and rail upgrades, trade agreements engineered for resilience, and a seamlessly operating supply chain, from EV showrooms to military hangars, are now in place. While the US remains caught up in internal disputes, Canada has secured markets, shaped alliance policy, and embedded itself into the core infrastructure of the 21st century economy.